Hey guys, this is JP again, and in this video I want to talk about the main problem for panpsychism, namely the combination problem, and I want to explain what is, in my opinion, the best answer to the combination problem, namely Bergsonian panpsychism. So without further ado, let's get to the combination problem. Basically, the combination problem is that for a panpsychist who says that consciousnesses, fundamental consciousnesses exist and they can combine into more complex consciousnesses. The issue is to explain why and how would those consciousnesses combine. It does not seem possible for consciousnesses to combine, for different subjects of consciousnesses to combine into more complex subjects. It's not something we generally observe, and we don't seem to need to postulate this either. So this is a point that was originally made by William James about a century ago. He took the example of a dozen men. Say you take a dozen men and you give them each a word to say in a sentence, and you ask them to say the word exactly at that time, following what this man said and before what this man said, and and you make the whole group say it really as one man. Still, you will not get the consciousness of a 13th man. And the idea here is not, just to take this process as an example, but it's no matter what you make those men do, it will never be clear, so William James says, that there is a 13th consciousness there. It will always seem ridiculous, so he says. And, in the same way that it doesn't seem possible for the consciousnesses of different people to combine into a more complex consciousness, we can't say the same thing, that it's just as ridiculous to suppose that the fundamental consciousnesses of fundamental particles would combine into more complex consciousnesses. So that panpsychism never really gets off the ground because consciousnesses just don't seem to combine ever. So that's the combination problem. Consciousnesses don't seem to be able to combine. And before moving on to the possible solutions to this problem, I want to describe what is an even harder problem for panpsychism. I think it's not only does the panpsychist need to explain why and how consciousnesses can combine, he also needs to explain why would evolution care about those combinations. Because if you're a panpsychist, and today most panpsychists would say that, well, the fundamental particles of physics, they follow some laws which are explained by the fundamental consciousnesses of those particles. So the reason why an electron does so and so, for example, is because of its consciousness. And ultimately, all the physical behaviors that are observed are still reduced to the behaviors of more simple entities, fundamental particles. So ultimately, everything could be explained using the fundamental consciousnesses of the world, so the consciousnesses of the fundamental particles. So even if, let's say, you're a panpsychist and you can somehow show that, well, consciousnesses can combine, they follow this and these laws, you can describe how consciousnesses combine using this set of laws and equations and so on, you still, so that you can say, well, then atoms, knowing what the fundamental particles, knowing what the fundamental consciousnesses are, they combine into those consciousnesses. Well, why would evolution care about that? If, no matter what the laws will be about those combinations, still you can explain the behavior of the atoms just using the behavior of the fundamental particles, which you explain using their consciousnesses. So you never need to appeal to higher consciousnesses. So it's very strange why evolution would have given us such complex consciousnesses, because if you take a human, let's say, my consciousness is extremely complex. Just looking at this right now, at this classroom, I see well-ordered desks, I see colors, I can hear sounds, I can even smell things. There's a whole bunch of phenomenal consciousnesses that are very much unified in my phenomenal consciousness, and there's no way this is random. Evolution doesn't do things like that randomly. This must serve a purpose. But if you're a panpsychist and you say that, like most panpsychists today, that ultimately you can explain everything by the fundamental consciousnesses, well, my consciousness doesn't seem to do anything, so why would evolution care? Why would evolution have given me such a complex consciousness? So this is the evolution, the problem of the evolution of consciousness for panpsychists. not only you need to explain why why fundamental consciousnesses can combine into more complex consciousnesses, you also need to explain why would evolution care about those combinations. So those are the two problems I'll be trying to address in this video. And the first step will be to look at what I think is the best naturalist solution, and then I'll move on to Bergson, which is not a naturalist. So first off, I think the best naturalist solution comes from a currently active philosopher of mind named Philip Goff. It's the spatial relation solution to the combination problem. The idea, it's pretty elegant. It's, in the same way that in my last video I explained why Panpsychism was popular, in part because it allowed you to fill the void left in the ontology of physics. Because the entities described by physics, let's say brain, neurons, atoms, and so on, they're only described extrinsically. And if you need to know what they are intrinsically, a good candidate is consciousness, because we know that we are conscious. We know that there is an intrinsic aspect to brains, let's say, namely human consciousness. So we do the same thing all the way down. The idea, it's a very nice idea by Philip Goff, is to do the same thing but with space-time. So because in the same way that we know that physical entities such as atoms, energy, and so on, they're described extrinsically by physics, but that's also true of space and time. Physicists only really describe the behavior of space and time, especially with relativity. You know how space and time behave, but you don't know what they are intrinsically. But a good candidate is to say that, well, the real nature of space and time is whatever combines consciousnesses. So, because what exists, if you look at the world, as a physicist, especially if you're a panpsychist as well, there are a bunch of fundamental consciousnesses that are in the world, and if you look at them physically, there are these particles, the physical aspects of the physical descriptions of those consciousnesses. They can combine into more complex things when they're in space-time. Well, if we want those things to combine phenomenally, if you want the consciousness to combine, it's very logical to say that, well, the way this combination works, if you look at it phenomenologically, then it's a combination of consciousnesses. The consciousnesses of the fundamental particles combine into atomic consciousnesses, let's say, while if you look at it physically, it will look like a combination in space-time. So if I get closer to the human level, well, my human consciousness would be the combination in space-time of the fundamental of the consciousnesses of my cells, of my body. So that's a pretty elegant solution, but it's called a Mysterian solution because it still leaves a bunch of mystery. And actually, Goff is pretty pessimistic about the idea that we could get further on this track, that we could really know what is the nature of space-time or the nature of the phenomenal bonding relation, of the combination relation for consciousnesses. And his basic argument is that, well, we only have access to one consciousness, so we cannot answer the question about the nature of the combination relation of consciousnesses, looking at consciousnesses, because at any moment I only have access to my consciousness. So I only have access to one consciousness. Because I only have access to one, then I cannot know what relations are as far as consciousnesses go. So I won't be able to answer the question on this side. And obviously, I also won't be able to answer the question on the physical side, because this side only tells me about things extrinsically. It never tells me about consciousnesses. So either way, I'll never be able to know what happens when consciousnesses combine. So that's why it's called the Mysterian solution. And I think it's a solution you can live with. Well, it's not surprising that, let's say, humans, we cannot answer all questions in the world, especially if you're a naturalist. Namely, you think that everything can be explained scientifically. Well, humans are the product of natural selection, and we haven't evolved to do metaphysics. We've evolved to solve practical problems. We've evolved to know things, know object entities in space-time because it's useful evolutionarily speaking, and we also know our own consciousness, but it's not really useful to know anything else. So it's not surprising that humans cannot answer the combination problem, let's say. That's a solution I think you can live with if you're a naturalist. But I think there's a better solution if you're willing to leave naturalism behind. It's quite a step, I know, it's kind of scary at first, but if if you bear with me and you follow until the end of this video, I think you'll see that Bergson, even though he has to leave naturalism behind, what he offers is so much greater. It answers so many more questions than it leaves open, that I think it's worth moving on away from naturalism and to embrace Bergsonian panpsychism. So let's get to it. The basic idea, I think, the first thing I should say about Bergson is that there are two sides to this. First off, he makes us realize that we're not as united as we think. So whereas, with Philip Goff, he said, well, we only have access to our consciousness, so we never know about relations of consciousnesses. That's not something Bergson holds. Bergson says that we can see actually our own consciousnesses combine and fragment, and we're not that united. And really, that's, I think, the key insight here with Bergson, because it breaks the Mysterian argument, and it will enable us to get an idea of how consciousnesses can combine and how we can fit with physics. It will enable us to know more about space-time, because as you recall, Philip Goff had the really nice idea of saying that the intrinsic nature of space-time is the combination of consciousnesses. Well, Bergson will say that because we do know what the combination of consciousnesses is, it does give us the actual nature of space-time. It does give us the intrinsic nature of space-time. And I think at first the thought experiments that Bergson asks us to consider can be maybe surprising, but I think as you live with them, as you keep this idea into your mind, it becomes something that you can notice more and more, and it becomes quite natural. The basic idea is that when we choose, our consciousness condenses smaller consciousnesses, whereas if we do not choose, or if we panic, if smaller consciousnesses govern, then our consciousness is fragmented. And we can notice this by especially the temporal span of our consciousness. When we make choices, our consciousness it will stretch longer in time. It will combine lots of consciousnesses and combine them further in time. Whereas if we do not make choices, if we're not able to make choices, then our consciousness will fragment and will get temporally shorter. I think, let's say, one way in which you can experience this is, let's say let's say you're typing something on your computer. You need to write an essay, for example. Well, the moment when you have a flash of what you will write for, let's say, the next sentence or the next paragraph, this is a flash where your consciousnesses will stretch in time. You will know for, let's say, the next 5-10 seconds what you will write. In one instant, you combine those consciousnesses, and you can especially see it if it's initially when you're sitting down to write. You have your computer screen in front of you. You have your keyboard. You feel the chair in your back and behind your legs. You feel maybe you hear sounds. You see a bunch of things. But when you make the choice to write those things for the next 5-10 seconds, you can see even that there's a bunch of stuff that goes away from your consciousness. You're not aware maybe of your chair or of the sound or a bunch of stuff in your peripheral vision. You're only aware of what you will do with the laptop, let's say, for the next 5-10 seconds. So you take a bunch of consciousnesses that are initially, they're shorter temporally, but they're more spread out in space, and you combine them into one consciousness that is longer in time but shorter in space. That's what happens when you make a choice. And conversely, I think a good example is, let's say you have a car accident. You have an accident in general, something bad happens. What will happen is your consciousness that was, maybe you were thinking 2-3 seconds ahead. You were somewhat aware of your surroundings. of maybe where you were sitting and so on. But when, let's say you have a car accident, um, all of a sudden you cannot think 2-3 seconds ahead. Your consciousness becomes really much thinner in time. Maybe you can only think like 0.5 seconds ahead, and all of a sudden you are aware of a bunch of stuff. As far as space goes, you feel you see maybe the car there, you see somewhere there, you see the sky, you feel your heartbeat, you feel maybe heavy in your legs, you have a bunch of sensations. It's very wide as far as your consciousness, but it's not very long. It's short in time. And the idea is that when we make choices, we take the consciousnesses of simpler systems. Let's say when I was typing, there was I was taking the consciousness of all my visual consciousnesses, all of my maybe the consciousness of my sensations in my back, of my earring. I take all of them and I combine them. I condense them into my human consciousness, my higher level consciousness. Whereas when I have a car accident, my human consciousness spreads out and it splits into the consciousness of my vision of this, of the feeling of my art, my feeling of this. I have a bunch of subsystems that become my consciousnesses. Instead of being united in one human consciousness, it's fragmented into several subsystems. So that's the Bergsonian answer to the combination problem. It's a condensation, which we can actually observe when we make choices, and a fragmentation when we cannot make choices. That's how consciousnesses combine. And that's the real nature of space-time for Bergson. What holds things together is choices of conscious agents. And a real plus with the Bergsonian solution is that it also allows us to answer the problem of the evolution of consciousness. And as I speak about this, I'll also be able to say more precisely why Bergson is not a naturalist, why I don't think it's useful to try to fit Bergson into naturalism. It's because when a level makes a choice, it influences the lower levels in a manner that is not previsible, even not statistically previsible. So when my human consciousness makes a choice, I influence my subsystems in a way that is not statistically previsible. I cannot, even if I knew, let's say, even if I knew the perfect physical description of my neurons, and I wanted to predict what Jean-Philippe, would do, I cannot do so when I make a choice. When I make a choice, I'm not previsible, not even statistically. It's only when my consciousness is fragmented, let's say when I have a car accident, that then because my subsystems are actually the ones leading me, because I'm not making choices, it's my subconsciousness that are, then you can actually predict my behavior because it's just a behavior of the subsystems. But even then, those, let's say, cellular consciousnesses, which are determining my behavior, they are still not previsible if you were to look at lower levels. Let's say every time the consciousness exists at one level, it's because it's a combination that is not reducible to the ones at the lower levels. There is a choice being made here, which is not reducible to the lower choices. Because if it were, then it would mean that there is no choice being made here. If all of my behavior is predictable, looking at the behavior of my subsystems, it means that I'm not really making a choice. So there's no combination there. There's no higher level consciousness. Like if you were to look at the table I'm standing in front of right now, well, it's not moving, it's not doing anything at my level, which means that there's no consciousness at my level because there's no action there. At most, maybe the table is conscious at the level of the atoms or maybe molecules, but because there's no action, there's no choice at the macro level, it means there's no consciousness there. So at every level, Bergson gives us a nice criterion to say when consciousnesses combine and when they don't. They combine when there's a choice made at the higher level, i.e. when the higher level is not predictable looking at the lower level. And we can see why Bergson is not a naturalist because of this. He's not a naturalist because he doesn't think the lower levels can be are sufficient to explain the higher levels, which means that at every level there's something that is not really predictable, that is somewhat mysterious. There's a choice, so it's not something that naturalists are comfortable with generally. Maybe there are some naturalists who want to be emergentists, meaning that, well, at this level, consciousness happens, and you can't predict this level looking at the lower levels. But they generally won't want to say this about every single level. So I don't think it's useful to describe Bergson as a naturalist. Maybe some people will want to try, but I just don't think it's useful. And it also enables us to see why Bergson can provide a satisfying answer to the problem of the evolution of consciousness. Well, if at every level the more complex consciousnesses can make choices that are not predictable, that are not reducible to the lower levels, it's obviously a big advantage, evolutionarily speaking, because it means the higher levels can behave much more complex, with much more complexity, can do more useful things than the lower levels. So it's not a surprise that evolution would favor arrangements which lead to more complex consciousnesses, to more complex choices. And more precisely, Bergson would say that evolution will favor organisms which are less and less determined, which have more and more choices, more and more choices open to them, more and more possibilities, which are less and less predictable. And another cool thing I should say is Bergson also can explain why the fundamental particles behave the way they do. He actually predicted this before quantum mechanics, and he didn't have the chance really to write more about this because he was really sick by the time quantum physics were theorized. It's, well, if the fundamental particles of physics have consciousnesses, but if you look at them, they're so short. Those consciousnesses are so simple, they're so short temporally that they cannot make complex choices, and that's why it will look random. They just make a lot of choices all the time, but they cannot plan ahead, so it looks random. So it's not surprising that if you look at them in the laboratory, they will look like they're following random laws, and they cannot be predicted at all. So yeah, that's all really I wanted to say on this video. Just to summarize, I explained why the main problem for panpsychism is the combination problem. Why do consciousnesses combine? Then I explained why a further problem is the evolution of consciousness. In addition to explaining how and why consciousnesses combine, you need to explain why evolution would care, why evolution would favor certain complex consciousnesses. Then I explained the best naturalist solution, which is the spatial solution of Philip Goff. So in the same way that in panpsychism, you say that, well, the real nature of physical entities is conscious, so of atoms and fundamental particles and so on. The real nature is conscious. Well, the real nature of space-time is the combination of consciousnesses. But that was the best that a naturalist would do. You cannot go any further, because if you're a naturalist and you don't think that, human consciousness, is a combination of lower consciousnesses that act on us and that we can act upon, or at least it's not useful, I think, to see naturalism this way, then you're kind of stuck there. You need to say, well, humans are not built to answer those questions, so we won't know. But that's something Bergson can do. Bergson can say that, well, we can observe our consciousness combining, or we can observe our consciousness condensing simple consciousnesses when we make choices, and fragment when we cannot make choices. And the notion of choice is really important there. It's when we make choices that we can combine consciousnesses, but because we talk about genuine choices here, choices that are not predictable using the lower levels, then this means that it's not useful to see Bergson as a naturalist, because at every level, human consciousness is not reducible to cell consciousnesses, and cell consciousness is not reducible to protein consciousnesses, and so on. Because this happens at every level where there's a genuine consciousness above, well, it's not useful to see Bergson as a naturalist, but it also allowed us to say why Bergson can answer the problem of the evolution of consciousness. Well, because if those more complex consciousnesses can do more complex things, literally in the world, then it means that there's a clear evolutionary advantage for them. So that's why Bergson can answer the combination problem and the problem of the evolution of consciousness. So thanks, guys, for listening.